The most powerful militaries on Earth rarely announce their intentions with a bomb. More often, they announce them with a sentence. A carefully worded statement designed not to destroy, but to corner. That is what happened when the United States military delivered its latest message to Tehran, and it is why this moment deserves more attention than the headlines suggest. On the surface, it read like routine posturing, the kind of language exchanged between rivals for decades. But look closer, and a different picture emerges. This was not a threat aimed at Iran's military capacity. It was aimed at something far more fragile, the decision-making of the men who run the Islamic Republic. Because here is the uncomfortable truth Iran's leadership now faces. Silence risks looking like weakness in front of their own hardliners. Retaliation risks a confrontation they cannot control and may not survive politically. There may be no option left that doesn't cost them something. That raises a question far more interesting than what did the U.S. say. The real question is whether Washington just designed a trap Tehran cannot escape, regardless of what it chooses to do next. To understand why this warning matters more than it appears, we need to go back to how we got here, and what exactly was said, by whom, and when. To understand what makes this warning significant, it helps to strip away the noise and look at what is actually known. The U.S. military's message did not arrive as an isolated event. It came after a period of heightened signaling between Washington and Tehran, a sequence of statements, troop positioning, and diplomatic silence that, taken together, suggested something was building beneath the surface. What we can confirm is this. American military channels communicated a direct message aimed at Iran's leadership, one explicitly framed around consequences rather than negotiation. That framing matters. Warnings issued through diplomatic back channels typically leave room for face-saving exits. Warnings issued through military channels rarely do. On the Iranian side, the initial response was measured, a mix of dismissal and calculated ambiguity, the kind of reaction regimes use when they need time to assess before committing to a position. That hesitation is itself informative. It suggests Tehran understood this was not routine rhetoric. Regional actors were watching closely too. Israel, already engaged in its own long-running shadow conflict with Iran, had every incentive to see Washington harden its posture. Gulf states, wary of being caught in the crossfire of any escalation, quietly recalibrated their own risk assessments. None of this happened in a vacuum. Each actor was responding not just to the immediate statement, but to years of accumulated tension, sanctions, proxy confrontations, and a fragile status quo that has held uneasily for over a decade. But a single warning, however pointed, doesn't fully explain why this moment feels different. The real answer isn't found in this week's headlines. It's found in a pattern of behavior stretching back much further. One that reveals exactly why Iran's leadership has historically avoided direct confrontation, and why that old playbook may no longer be enough. To understand why this moment feels different, we need to look at how Iran's leadership has handled confrontation for the past 4 decades. Since the earliest days of the Islamic Republic, Tehran's strategy has rested on a single guiding principle: avoid direct war with a superior military power, and instead absorb pressure while building leverage through patience, proxies, and calculated ambiguity. Analysts have long described this as Iran's doctrine of strategic patience, a willingness to endure short-term humiliation in exchange for long-term survival. This approach was not born out of weakness alone. It was shaped by hard experience. The Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s left the country with a lasting understanding of just how costly direct, prolonged conflict could be, both economically and politically. From that point forward, Tehran built a security doctrine designed to project influence without inviting the kind of overwhelming retaliation that direct confrontation with the United States would guarantee. That doctrine matured over decades into a distinctive playbook, rather than confronting American power head-on. Iran extended its reach through allied militias and political movements across the region, allowing it to exert pressure while maintaining a layer of deniability. When tensions spiked. During previous rounds of sanctions, naval incidents in the Persian Gulf were targeted killings of Iranian commanders. Tehran typically responded through indirect channels rather than direct military action against American forces. This pattern held even through moments that many expected to trigger open war. Time and again, warnings were issued, retaliatory rhetoric followed, and yet direct escalation was avoided. It became almost a diplomatic ritual, threats exchanged, symbolic responses delivered, and the underlying status quo preserved. Both sides, in effect, learned the limits the other was willing to test. But here is what makes history useful, rather than simply reassuring. Every one of those previous moments occurred under specific conditions. A regime confident in its internal cohesion, a leadership structure capable of absorbing criticism from hardliners without fracturing, and an economic situation painful but survivable. Strategic patience is not a fixed trait. It is a strategy that depends on the regime's ability to manage its own internal pressures while appearing resolute to the outside world. That distinction matters enormously right now, because internal pressure inside Iran today looks different than it did during earlier confrontations. Economic strain has deepened. Public trust in the leadership has eroded in ways previous crises did not produce. And hardline factions within the regime have grown more vocal about demanding visible strength rather than quiet endurance, which raises the real question this documentary is built around. If Iran's traditional playbook was designed for a version of the regime that no longer fully exists, can that same strategic patience still function today? Or has Washington's latest warning arrived at precisely the moment when Iran's old strategy of quiet endurance is no longer available to it? To understand why this warning is different, it helps to reconsider what a military warning is actually designed to do. It is rarely intended to communicate information the other side doesn't already possess. Iran's leadership knows the extent of American military capability. What a warning like this one actually communicates is timing, resolve, and, most importantly, an implicit demand for a response, one way or another. That is what makes this moment strategically unusual. This wasn't simply a message to Iran's military planners. It was a message aimed squarely at the internal balance of power inside Tehran itself. Every government, even an authoritarian one, must manage two audiences simultaneously: the external adversary it is negotiating or competing with, and the internal factions whose support keeps it in power. For Iran's leadership, this second audience has become increasingly difficult to manage. Over the past several years, hardline factions within the Revolutionary Guard and allied political circles have grown louder in their criticism of what they view as excessive caution. Meanwhile, more pragmatic officials have continued to argue for restraint, wary of triggering a confrontation the country's strained economy cannot absorb. A public warning from the U.S. military does not just threaten Iran externally. It forces this internal argument into the open. Silence, in that context, becomes politically costly. It can be framed by hardliners as proof that the leadership has grown too cautious, too willing to accept humiliation rather than project strength. But a visible retaliatory response carries its own danger. The risk of triggering an escalation cycle that Iran's leadership has spent 40 years trying to avoid, one that could threaten not just military assets, but the broader stability of the regime itself. This is the essence of the impossible choice. It is not a simple binary of war or peace. It is a test of internal political survival, wrapped inside an external military signal. There is also a quieter, less visible dimension to this pressure: economic leverage. Years of sanctions have left Iran's economy in a fragile state, with currency depreciation, inflation, and constrained oil exports limiting the regime's room to maneuver. A direct military confrontation risks accelerating economic contraction at a moment when public frustration over economic conditions is already elevated. Iran's leadership must therefore weigh not just the immediate military risk of any response, but its economic aftershocks. Sanctions could tighten further, energy exports could be disrupted, and any resulting instability could compound tensions that already exist domestically. Intelligence considerations add another layer. Appointed. Public warning like this often follows periods of intelligence gathering, signaling to an adversary that their internal deliberations, communications, or military movements are being closely monitored. Whether or not Iran's leadership can independently confirm the extent of what American intelligence knows. The psychological effect of a direct warning is to introduce uncertainty, forcing Tehran's decision-makers to second-guess how much of their strategic thinking may already be visible to Washington. Diplomatically, the timing carries its own signal as well. Warnings delivered through military channels, rather than through diplomatic back channels, tend to foreclose the option of a quiet, face-saving resolution. This suggests either a deliberate American strategy to narrow Iran's available options, or a judgment that previous diplomatic signaling had failed to produce the desired restraint. Put together, these layers, internal political pressure, economic vulnerability, intelligence signaling, and diplomatic framing, reveal why this moment cannot be understood merely as a bilateral military standoff. It is a multidimensional pressure campaign, one that targets not just Iran's military calculus, but the internal cohesion of its leadership. And that is precisely why the stakes extend far beyond Tehran. A leadership forced into an impossible choice does not make that choice in isolation. Its decision, whichever direction it takes, will ripple outward across a region already balanced on a fragile equilibrium, reshaping calculations in capitals far beyond Iran's borders. A dilemma this significant rarely stays contained within the borders of the country experiencing it, whatever Iran's leadership ultimately decides. The consequences will extend well beyond Tehran, reshaping calculations across a region already balanced on a fragile equilibrium. Consider Israel first. For years, Israel has pursued a shadow campaign against Iranian influence, targeting proxy networks, disrupting weapons transfers, and applying pressure through covert operations rather than open warfare. A hardened American posture toward Iran effectively strengthens Israel's hand without requiring it to expend additional resources. If Washington is willing to apply direct pressure, Israel gains room to intensify its own operations, calculating that American resolve reduces the risk of unchecked Iranian retaliation against Israeli territory. Gulf states face a different calculation entirely. Countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE have spent the last several years cautiously rebuilding diplomatic channels with Tehran, prioritizing economic stability and regional de-escalation over confrontation. For these governments, an American-Iranian standoff represents genuine risk rather than opportunity. Their economies depend on stable shipping lanes through the Persian Gulf and uninterrupted energy markets. Any scenario involving Iranian retaliation, particularly against shipping routes or regional infrastructure, threatens the very stability these states have worked to secure. This is where public narrative and strategic reality diverge sharply. While headlines frame this as a U.S.-Iran story, Gulf capitals are quietly recalculating their own exposure to a conflict they did not choose and cannot fully control. Then there's the global energy dimension. Iran sits astride the Strait of Hormuz, through which a substantial share of the world's seaborne oil trade passes. Even the perception of heightened confrontation introduces risk premiums into energy markets, affecting prices long before any actual disruption occurs. This is a critical distinction. Markets often react to probability, not certainty. The mere existence of an impossible choice scenario is enough to influence global energy calculations, regardless of which option Iran ultimately selects. beyond the region. This moment carries weight for how other global powers interpret American resolve: China and Russia, both of whom maintain strategic and economic relationships with Iran. We'll be watching closely to assess whether Washington's warning represents genuine commitment or calculated bluff, their own strategic postures, from Taiwan to Ukraine, are shaped partly by their reading of American willingness to follow through on stated red lines elsewhere in the world. In this sense, Iran becomes a kind of testing ground, a case study other capitals will study for clues about American resolve more broadly. This is the deeper pattern often missed in day-to-day coverage. Confrontations like this rarely stay confined to their original participants. They ripple outward, reshaping the strategic assumptions of allies, rivals, and neutral observers alike, a choice framed as Iran's alone is. In reality, a decision point being watched and recalculated by half a dozen governments simultaneously. Which brings us to the most important question this documentary has been building toward. If the stakes are this widely distributed, and the pressure on Iran's leadership this severe, what happens next isn't simply a matter of Iranian intention. It is a question of which scenario, among several plausible paths, is most likely to unfold, and what each of those paths would mean for the wider world watching closely, given everything we've examined. There are several realistic paths forward, and each carries a distinct strategic logic, along with its own set of risks. The first, and arguably most consistent with Iran's historical playbook, is continued strategic silence. Under this scenario, Iran's leadership absorbs the pressure publicly while working through indirect channels to signal resolve to its domestic audience. This preserves the fragile status quo and avoids direct military escalation. But it comes at a cost. Every act of restraint in the face of a public warning erodes the credibility Iran has spent decades cultivating, both regionally and among its own hardline factions. The longer this silence continues, the harder it becomes to justify internally. The second scenario involves escalation through proxy forces rather than direct confrontation. This has long been Iran's preferred method of projecting strength while maintaining deniability, and it remains the option most consistent with precedent. Under this path, allied militias or political movements across the region might increase activity, allowing Tehran to demonstrate resolve without directly engaging American forces. The risk here is calibration. Proxy escalation is inherently harder to control than direct state action, and miscalculation by an allied group could trigger a response neither side originally intended. A third possibility, less dramatic but strategically significant, involves a shift toward diplomatic backchannels. Despite the public nature of the American warning, quiet negotiations remain possible, particularly if both sides recognize that direct confrontation serves neither's long-term interests. This path would allow Iran's leadership to claim a face-saving resolution domestically, framing any eventual de-escalation as the product of firm negotiation rather than capitulation. The challenge is credibility. After a public warning delivered through military channels, a purely diplomatic resolution may appear, to hardliners, indistinguishable from surrender. The fourth scenario, while less probable, cannot be dismissed, a miscalculation leading to direct confrontation. This would represent a significant break from decades of established behavior, and it is not the outcome most analysts consider likely, but it remains within the range of possibility, particularly if internal pressure inside Iran's leadership reaches a point where visible action becomes politically unavoidable, regardless of the external military risk involved. What ties these scenarios together is a single underlying truth. This is no longer simply a question of external deterrence. It has become a test of internal political management under conditions Iran's leadership has not faced in quite this configuration before. Strategic patience worked in the past because the regime could absorb criticism from its own hardliners while appearing resolute externally. That balancing act is now considerably harder to maintain. For outside observers, the coming weeks matter less for what is said publicly, and more for subtle indicators, shifts in proxy activity, changes in official rhetoric, movements in energy markets, or unusual diplomatic engagements through third-party intermediaries. These are the signals that will reveal, long before any official announcement, which direction Iran's leadership is actually leaning. What is clear is this: whichever path Tehran chooses, the decision will not be made in a vacuum, and it will not be cost-free. Each option carries consequences that extend well beyond this single moment. Which brings us, finally, to the deeper question this entire story has been building toward. Return, for a moment, to the question we opened with. Was this warning designed to prevent a conflict, or to guarantee that Iran's leadership would be trapped regardless of how it responded? The evidence suggests something more precise than either explanation alone. This wasn't simply deterrence, and it wasn't simply provocation. It was a calculated test of whether Iran's decades-old strategy of quiet endurance still functions under a regime facing unprecedented internal strain. That is the real story here, not a single warning, but a moment that exposed how fragile the old playbook has become. Strategic patience worked for 40 years because Iran's leadership could absorb criticism from within while projecting resolve outward. What this moment reveals is how narrow that margin has grown. Economic strain, eroded public trust, and increasingly vocal hardline factions have left far less room to maneuver than in previous confrontations. Whatever Iran ultimately chooses, silence, proxy escalation, quiet diplomacy, or something less predictable, the choice itself will say less about American military power than it does about the internal condition of Iran's regime, which leaves us with the question worth carrying forward. Every government eventually reaches a moment when its old strategies stop matching new realities. The real story of this warning may not be what America intended by sending it, but whether Iran's leadership still has a strategy left that can survive receiving it.